in
Yo, what
Canada
up?
reflected
Hope y'all are all
in, say,
having a good
Scotland
day.
and in Ireland in particular, in the UK, in England, and that's the terrain that we're exploring. So join us. It'll be quite a ride.
I'm not
So,
skateboarding in
Marty, I
a
think we got
garage,
in
but
touch with each other again most recently because I was obsessing
just chilling.
ironically about a new Canadian bill, C-63, which seemed to me to be a real masterpiece of right-thinking, utopian, resentful foolishness. And I thought it would be real useful to talk to you about that, to make sure that I understood it. And but I thought I'd start our discussion, or we could start a discussion today by going back into the past 8 years into the legal domain in Canada to discuss Bill C-16, because that's now 8 years ago. And in some ways, the bill that was at the origin of the current rat's nest of pathological legislation in Canada. And so, do you want to bring everybody up to date, just to begin with, or remind them, or educate them about what Bill C-16 was and what the fears were at the time and whether or not those have been realized?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jordan. Well, C-16 is when you and I met. And you were concerned, as I was. And
y'all know Jordan Peterson? He's a good dude.
Not very many others, mind you.
Subscribe
concerned
to Jordan Peterson.
Proposed amendments to the Canadian
He's all right. You got to get to know him, you know, and listen to him for a long period of time. He starts to sound more and more like a real,
essentially to require people to use the preferred pronouns of other people. And frankly, the establishment types poo-pooed the idea and called us fearmongers. And of course, that's turned out to be entirely untrue. You were exactly right in your concerns. That kind of amendment had been made before in provincial human rights.
Yeah, got some condensation going in there.
But that's in there now.
It started fogging up.
Pronoun trouble. But the present bill that you referred to, C-63, is C-16 on steroids. It's got 3 categories of bad in it. One's an administrative bad, one is a criminal code bad, criminal law bad, and the other one is, again, like C-16, a Canadian Human Rights Act amendment. So let me do the last one first.
And so what's the purported purpose of the law?
Well, the purported purpose, it starts with the cover of protecting children.
Right.
From online harm. That's the first administrative law.
Who could possibly oppose that?
This is part of the beauty of the way they go about these things. It's got great cover, and nobody in their right mind would want to come out and say, "Well, that's not a good idea."
Mm-hmm.
But what that kind of cover enables is
that looks dope.
A crackdown on the very idea of free speech. So let's just
I want some of those.
The human rights aspect first. They are returning to the Canadian Human Rights Act, an old section that got thrown out, got
but like pink and yellow
during the
or some other colors.
Stephen Harper, when Harper was the Prime Minister, and it was causing all kinds of nuisance. It was the kind of section, and these kinds of sections also appear in the provincial codes. Every province and the federal government has their own.
$200.
And these codes,
get the prescription ones,
but typically include this kind of.
So if you want like 4 or 5 of them, it's going to be like $800.
In your speech is what some of them say, and this.
I only got one.
Section basically says that if you use hateful speech that can be taken to vilify an individual or group, then you will be acting discriminatorily and therefore in breach of the code and therefore potentially liable to any of the perceived victims and also potentially to the government itself. And one of the problems with the human rights regime is that complaints can be made very, very easily without a lawyer, without any cost. And because the Canadian federal government has jurisdiction over the internet, this section is going to authorize complaints of all kinds to be made.
Like Johnny Depp and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
About any and everything. So it's going to have a chilling effect upon speech, no question about it. You put that together with the criminal code amendments. Those criminal code
I
amendments
look like that
make
now.
it. Well,
I watched that movie when I was
here's one
16,
extraordinary
17
thing
years
that it does.
old.
It
Fear and Loathing in
makes
Las Vegas.
the sentence, the maximum sentence for any violation of an offense.
On shrooms. I was actually on shrooms when I
in the
watched
criminal
it.
code or under federal legislation.
No.
Any offense that is motivated by hatred
Mhm.
will carry a maximum sentence of life
Right.
imprisonment.
Right.
Now, the defenders of the bill say, well, don't worry, the judge isn't actually going to give you life. That's not likely to happen. And that may be true, but that's not the point. If you don't mean it in legislation, then don't give the judge the power.
If it's in the law, it's likely to happen.
If it's in the law, it is going to happen sooner or later, and it is a signal about what
Wow.
is lawful and what is not, and what the
Look at those
proper punishment
aviator
should be
glasses.
and what is not. So, C63
I love that.
is a reflection of how just
You
one
know how,
more
like,
reflection of how we are
There's things
losing the
that
law.
you don't really
We are
want,
losing
but then somebody
the
gives it to you,
the
and then you
idea
like it a
of free
lot.
speech itself. You know that old quote that people always refer to?
That's like me
from
with the aviators.
Voltaire's biographer. The one that goes, I disagree with what you say,
Mhm.
but I'll defend to the death your right to say. I think the reason that that quote is trotted out so often is that when you come right down to it, most people don't agree with that.
Mhm.
Everybody says they believe
Try
in
not
free
to
speech.
break any
Everybody-
bones,
Justin
because if
Trudeau
you break some bones,
has said he believes in free speech.
I have arthritis in
There's
my
a guarantee of free speech
toe,
in the
in my big
Chinese
toe,
Constitution.
and it
Right.
Okay?
sucks.
It's very easy to say. And what they really mean is, yes, I believe in free speech, but,
Yeah.
and it's within the but.
I'm scared to
when
have
you
it on my
find
back
out
and my
whether or
neck,
not they really do
or my
believe in
shoulder.
free speech. So, for my money, we shouldn't have a law that prohibits hate speech. Hate speech is ugly, but people hate each other, and if they're not allowed to
Hate
say that
speech
they
is
do,
a part of
well,
freedom
then their
of
speech is
speech.
not free. So,
It's also a very difficult and challenging thing to make an emotion illegal. So
no doubt, and of course, the definition of what they mean
Well,
by hate speech
we'll get to
is,
that.
They're talking about
it's
Canada.
impossible to tell, and it's going to be under the purview of the judge to decide in any particular case whether or not you cross that threshold.
Okay,
Jordan
so
Peterson's from
Let's
Canada.
talk about the devil in the details, because the angel lurking over all of this is fundamentally we're protecting children from being exploited online. Okay, so while there are children and they are exploited online and they deserve protection, so that's all and good. What steps are taken in the bill to actually protect children who are being exploited online?
Right.
And then how do we segue
Jordan
from that
Peterson
to
is
hate?
a good
'Cause
guy.
Those aren't the same
He's a
universe.
warrior for
There's, as I said, there are three bits in the bill, and
peace,
they're in the same
stability.
bill, but
Yeah.
they're distinct. So there's the human rights aspect, there's the criminal code aspect, and then this third aspect, which is primarily one that's aimed at the protecting kids, is an administrative regime that gives an agency the power essentially to supervise the online platforms. But it also gives them the power to make the rules. So we don't even know what the rules are going to be. Basically, it just gives the whole control of the thing to a government agency, to the bureaucrats, to do as they think best. In
Right,
the
so
name
they're
of.
establishing an entirely new bureaucracy
Exactly, yes.
with an unspecified range of power, with a non-specific purview that purports to protect children from online exploitation, but has the possibility of turning into a policing
Yes.
state for the internet per se.
This is often how the administrative state works, right? So this agency will not be policing citizens themselves directly, but they'll be policing the online platforms, and the platforms will thereby censor the people who are using them. So we're not doing it. We're hands off. We're two steps removed situation, but in effect, it is the government pulling the strings of the.
Okay, so to what degree do you think that even the setup of that new administrative bureaucracy, which has very extensive powers and very poorly defined powers as far as I could tell when I read the bill,
Yes.
how much of that do you think is actually devoted genuinely I know this is a judgment call, obviously, but you have to infer that from the legislation.
Right.
If the legislation was honest and well-written, it would very specifically target the target of its purported reason for existence.
Yes, yes,
Right?
yes.
If it was designed, for example, to produce a more general regime for online policing, to me, that's what it looks like. And if so, is that a consequence of poor legislative design? Is it a consequence of intent? Like, what do you think's going on there?
Well, what's going on there is what's been going on inside our law with respect to empowering the administrative state for a long, long time, right? So standard legislation now, at either the federal or provincial level, is authorizing legislation, meaning you pass a bill about a certain subject, and it might contain some rules in it, but it also contains the authority, the delegation of authority to the bureaucrats, to an agency of some kind, to the minister, or to whoever, to a Human Rights Commission, to make policies or guidelines or regulations about certain things. And you can't tell by reading the statute what the rules are. Right. And so you've transferred legislative authority essentially from the legislature to the bureaucracy. And this is not the bureaucracy stealing it. This is the legislature giving it, because they don't want the responsibility of doing it, and they don't want to have to go through the minutiae of figuring out what the right rules are. So they just shove it off into the back rooms, and this is the way the administrative state works. Now, it's a kind of collusion between the legislature and the courts. So the courts, we have these three branches of government. Yes, we have the legislature, we have the courts, and we have the administrative state. And, the division between them is cleanest in the American version of things. But in Canada and the UK, we have them as well. And the legislature and the courts are together supposed to be supervising what the executive branch, the administrative state, is doing. Because the general rule is supposed to be the administration, which used to be the king after all, can't do anything that's not authorized by the legislature. Okay? So these three things are checks and balances on each other.
Yeah.
But now they're all on the same page. And the courts and the legislature are convinced about the need for this expansive, overwhelming administrative state. And so instead of supervising the administrative branch, and the courts, instead of making sure that they stick within their powers, the legislature's delegating to it, and the courts are deferring to it. And so what we end up with...
And the legislators don't have to take responsibility.
Exactly.
In either way.
Because we can't find who's responsible anymore.
Yeah.
Right? It's all sort of a mystery. It's a moving ball. And this is the way administrative agencies and government departments and ministries can be, quote, agile. They want to be agile. They want to be able to respond to societal problems quickly. Right? Well, if you're able to respond quickly, that means you have the legislative power in your hands. Yeah. And that nobody else knows exactly what's going on until it happens, and sometimes not until after the fact, even. Right? So that principle of the rule of law that said the rule applies to everybody, both the ruled and the ruler. If you have an agile government making rules up as they go along, well, that means by definition the rules can't apply to them because they have the power to change them whenever they want to. And so we have agile governments who are managing us, managing society, solving social problems. We are in a managerial era in the law. Management, I would put it this way, management, the ethos of managerialism has supplanted the rule of law as the basic idea. Instead of the rule of law, we have rule by law now, which means that the law is nothing more than a tool for the government to use to create on a whim, whenever they need it to make you do this. And there was no better example of all of this than during COVID. You had people standing behind microphones on a Tuesday afternoon saying, well, the rule tomorrow is going to be this. That's agile government. It means the legislature is not taking on its role of making the rules. And the executive branch has taken over making the rules, applying the rules, and enforcing the rules, all on its own. And that is not the way the Western legal system used to work. We have managerialism instead of the rule of law.
Constantine, is there anything so far in Bruce's discussion that's triggered any echoes about similar situations in the UK?
Well, there's a couple of pieces that I would pick up on that I think are relevant. And the first one is what you mentioned about the fact that the bill is quite expensive.
Oh, that's from that show.
Part of it appears to be dealing with the core issue.
When he was on that show,
which is the
trigonometry.
children. We had the online harms bill, which was ostensibly about the same thing, but in its original drafting included all sorts of other things completely unrelated to any of that. And it's not a surprise, because what we have seen over and over in the UK is that quite often the attempt to protect people from hate or whatever has actually nothing to do with the trigger that causes. So I'll give you an example. Sir David Ames was an MP who was murdered by a terrorist. And the next day, all his colleagues went into Parliament and started talking in Parliament about how this shows that we need to tackle online hate. David Ames wasn't killed by online hate, he was killed by an Islamist. Likewise, more recently, Parliament actually, to cut a very long story short, suspended its own rules of procedure because Labour Party MPs feared what would happen to them if they did not vote the correct way on the Israel-Palestine conversation. And again, following the furore that broke out from that, the argument was, well, MPs need to be nicer to each other, instead of dealing with the fact that there was a mob outside Parliament who was intimidating the parliamentarians. So very often, it seems to me that a lot of the time the mind has been made up that we need to deal with online hate, whatever that means, and then whatever happens is then used as an excuse to do that. Secondly,
it's got to be kind of in the nature of I think how tyranny unfolds in the real world. It's something like there's a pre-commitment to a set of ideological axioms, and then whatever crisis comes along is just assimilated to that and used as a shoehorn to move it forward. And so, has there ever been a tyranny that's emerged spontaneously that didn't present itself to begin with as fostering security and improving civic health or public health for that matter? The Nazis were improving public health like mad throughout the 1930s. I mean, some of that public health improvement was genuine. There's a fair bit of it that wasn't, but the cover story was really solid, right? And it was often compassion, even with the whole the catastrophic Nazi policies of euthanasia that culminated in the Holocaust began it with the language of compassion, right? So.
Well, quite. And actually, the thing that really revealed to me how much of this is ideological was I was on a British program called Question Time, which you've been on. And what they do is they have a panel of guests. And before the main show starts, they do one question for discussion that is a warm-up. It's not recorded. So people are a little bit more loose in that part of it. And the question at the time was, Donald Trump had just been banned from Facebook. Was this the right thing to do, whatever? And, they came to me, I made the deeply controversial point that I think the president of the most powerful country in the world should be allowed to speak in public. This didn't go down well. But what happened afterwards, they went to the left-wing politician on the panel, the Labour politician on the panel, and she, without missing a beat, when they went to her, she went, "We must have the safest internet in the world." And to a round of applause. And what that signaled to me, I think, gentlemen, is that we have completely lost the battle over the way the conversation is being had in being able and willing to say some harm is a consequence of freedom, and that's the price that we're willing to pay. And I believe that until we get the conversation onto that footing, we're never going to win this argument, because if the argument is about, well, we must make people safe, then that will always necessitate more tyranny. By default.
Of course.
And so I see, certainly in the UK, I wouldn't speak for Canada or the United States, a complete failure of, quote-unquote, our side to make that argument, that we are willing to sacrifice some, whatever safety means in the context of words, and that's a whole bunch of BS in my opinion anyway, whatever that means, that has a price, And there comes a point where too much safety means too much giving up of freedom, and we're not prepared to do that. We haven't been able to make that argument.
I agree with you, and I think one of the problems is that we approach that argument from the wrong end.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, I think we should start with the presumption that you're allowed to say anything you want, like anything you want. Now, what might the exceptions to that be? Well, here's one. If I go up to somebody on the sidewalk and say, "Give me your wallet, or I'll stab you."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that crosses a line because now I'm threatening imminent violence. That's an assault, and it's okay for us to say, no, that's not allowed because it's violence. But if you start from that end, then you can say, well, what are there any other exceptions? And maybe yes, and maybe no. If you start at the harm end, I mean, there's all kinds of harm you do just by speaking that's in ways that are clearly
Anything serious.
anything
About
serious.
anything serious.
If you're campaigning to be elected to something, then you are trying to do harm to your opponents. You want to make them lose. Or if you are
It's called
if you are
mudslinging.
running a commercial enterprise,
It's called
and you want to
mudslinging.
outsell your neighboring competitor, you're trying to do them harm. And if you succeed, you will do them harm. Maybe they go out of business. That's legit. You are allowed to cause people harm by your speech. Harm is not something that's prohibited. We have to get back to the idea that we live in the world, and people succeed and they fail, and sometimes they fail because of what other people do, and too bad because they're free. It's a free world. In a free world, you are going to be hurt by other people. Too bad.
So let's go back here now to how we get from protecting children against online exploitation, which apparently necessitates, as you pointed out, the construction of a very ill-defined, expensive, and highly autonomous new administrative system, not bound, if I remember correctly, by normal rules of evidence.
Well, well, number one, that's absolutely true in the administrative realm, but it's also true in the human rights realm. So these commissions and tribunals, I sat on a tribunal for a while.
Yeah.
They look like sort of courtrooms. If you go into the room, it looks like it's set up like a courtroom.
Yeah.
You got a bench and somebody making a decision and witnesses and so on. But they're not courts because, well, for various reasons, they're created by governments, first of all. They're basically a part of the executive branch of government, even though they look like a court. But they don't adhere to normal rules of evidence.
Right.
And to what extent they do on any particular occasion might vary. It depends upon the rules of that particular tribunal. So, people have called them kangaroo courts.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's deserved.
Mm-hmm.
But it's part of the trend of taking decisions away from courts and giving them to the executive branch of government. But mind you, the courts haven't been all that good in recent years either. As I've been saying, we are losing the law. Let me put it this way. You've been talking especially for a long time about how institutions in society have been compromised, been taken over by wokeism, by social justice, by critical theory, and so on. Well, the law is an institution. It's one of these social institutions, one of these public institutions. There's no reason why the law should be immune from all those factors as any other institution like government, like universities, like public schools, like media. It's happening to the law too. It's happening now. Don't get me wrong. In Canada, we have some terrific judges, and we have cases that go the way they're supposed to, and they're heard the way they're supposed to, with proper rules of evidence and the proper analysis. And so this is not a black and white thing, but more and more you are seeing from the courts evidence that the paradigm has changed or is changing from what a lot of people think in their heads is the way the law should work to what actually is the case now.
And what's the case now?
So let me give you an example.
Yeah.
So we have a section in our charter that says that everybody is equal under the law. They're entitled to equal protection under the law, which is what the U.S. Constitution says as well. But over the past 40 years of charter jurisprudence, by the Supreme Court of Canada. That section now means that people are not entitled to equal protection, that is equal treatment by the law. They're entitled to equal or equivalent outcomes between groups.
Right.
So let me give you an example of perhaps the most recent important Supreme Court of Canada case on this idea. Many years ago, the RCMP created a job sharing plan wherein full-time members could combine with 2 or 3 other members to decide to work part-time. It's voluntary. People who work part-time, if you want to work part-time and you're working full-time, then we're going to allow you to do that. And we're going to give you a pension as well. And the pension, if you're part-time, will be calculated in the same way that the pension is calculated for the full-time people, which is proportionate to the hours that you work. Okay? Voluntary. Over time, what happens? More women than men voluntarily sign up
Yeah.
for the part-time work.
Right, of course.
And then at the end of the day, that means that more women than men have lower pensions than the men who are working full-time.
Yeah.
The program is challenged under Section 15(1) of the Charter. Supreme Court of Canada says unconstitutional.
By definition.
By definition, you can't have a voluntary equal program that results in different results for women than men.
It's a little hard on the whole notion of voluntary there, isn't it?
Exactly. Equal rules, voluntary program, open to everybody,
Yeah.
treats everybody the same way.
Yeah.
Not constitutional.
Oh boy. When was that ruling?
2019, I believe.
Oh yeah, that's a rough one. Okay, so how did we get from protecting vulnerable children from online sexual exploitation with a gigantic, unnamed bureaucracy with indefinite rights and virtually no responsibility to whatever the hell hateful speech is? I mean, first of all, we might ask ourselves, Constantine, you can weigh in here too, is like the whole notion of hateful speech, that's a troublesome one for me because there's a obvious element of subjective judgment in it, like a clearly obvious one. And the problem for me is always, as soon as someone talks about hateful speech, isn't so much whether or not there are forms of speech that are detestable, because you haven't lived if you haven't listened to somebody say something detestable, perhaps sometimes in jest, which is a very interesting, variation of that possibility. But like, who decides that it's hateful? On what grounds? Like, and why do you decide the people who are making that judgment? And then that problem's very much amplified, if you open the door, as this bill does, to anonymous denunciations.
Sure.
Right now, everybody, including every school child who's like older than 3, and maybe even at 3, understands that there's almost nothing worse than a snitch. And all children are wise enough to know that even if you are being bullied at school, let's say, it has to get pretty damn brutal and bad before going to report it to the authorities is acceptable or justifiable. Now, you can debate about the conditions under which that should or shouldn't occur. My point is that even kids know that even under dire circumstances, there's almost nothing worse than a snitch. And yet these bills, and we certainly know from places like the Soviet Union, just exactly what happens, or East Germany, what happens when 1/3 of the citizens, which was the case in East Germany, become government informers. It's like trust's gone, the worst people have the upper hand, it's complete bloody catastrophe. Now, in Bill C-63, you have a concatenation of these problems.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
okay, now hate speech is going to be constrained, and it can be identified by anonymous informants. Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit, if I got that right, first of all.
Well, yes, but let's just back up to your children point.
Yeah.
Right. So part of the problem is the premise, and the premise is widely accepted because we accept this premise generally now in society because this is where we're at. But the premise is that the government is responsible for keeping people safe, including the children. And that's ignoring the best mechanism we already have to keep children safe, which is their parents. right? It's assuming that this is what this state is for. If you went up to somebody on the street, anybody at random, and you said, you know, do you think we should have an expansive administrative state? And by that I mean, you know, all these government people who do all these things. They probably look at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's what government is. That's what government's for. What do you mean? What does government do other than solve problems for society by making these rules and doing policy and so on? And we've lost the proposition that we've made a choice to have this large, overwhelming government tell us what to do in place of all of the other things we used to have. Individual decisions, families, communities, churches, all of the non-public institutions, I mean government institutions. Government just rules the day now. And we're debating about whether or not the government has done this job properly or not well. Well, the problem is the government's doing the job. The government, for my money, shouldn't be in this business. They shouldn't be in the business of regulating speech for hateful impact.
Why not?
Well, because if we think we live in a free country, if the government's in this business, then we're wrong.
So your point is something like that the cost of having the government offer all potential services, say in relationship to desire and safety, is that you lose all your autonomy and your freedom.
Well, let's back up. What rights should we have is where we should start. What rights do you have? If you're a free person, what does that mean? I think it means that other people can't coerce you, can't interfere with you, can't take your stuff, can't use force against you. That means you're free. That means other people can't do it, and means the state can't do it. That's the sphere of freedom that you have. That means that the government needs to do one job, which is to make sure other people don't coerce you and use force against you and take your stuff. Job done. If somebody says something you don't like and causes you psychological angst, too bad. That person is free, and so are you. Put up with it. It's part of the world. As soon as you get governments overstepping that zone that I just described, you start to move away from that conception of freedom into a different kind of society altogether. And we are so far along that path that I don't know how we can call ourselves a free country, a free people with a straight face. It's just...
Well, Bill C-63 certainly is one of the pieces of legislation that make you question that.
Oh, absolutely. But Bill C-63 is just one step along the way. So let's go back to the courts, because part of the fault of C-63, it's a government bill, so it's a legislative problem. But the courts, the Supreme Court of Canada, already said, essentially, that this kind of restriction on speech is constitutional. And in fact, in C-63, they've used some of the language the Supreme Court of Canada said was okay. So the Supreme Court of Canada took this charter we have, which says everybody has the right to free speech, and said, well, sure, everyone has the right to free speech, but not this.
Well, he used that against me.
Of course they did.
Yeah.
Of course they
I'm
did.
a direct beneficiary of that line of reasoning. I have freedom of speech, but it's subject to reasonable limitations. And what are those? Well, they're whatever any reasonably constituted bureaucracy deem they might be. That's basically what you told me.
But that makes a mockery of the whole idea of having a constitution.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
So,
I think that was kind of the point.
Here's the point. The point is that our charter, people think of our charter of rights as the beginning as the foundation of our legal system, and it's not. It's a mere gloss on legislative supremacy and now judicial supremacy, because the court can decide what those rights mean however it wants.
Yeah.
And more they are less robust individual rights and more justifications for the administrative state to do things in the public good. So people are putting much too much weight on the fact that we have a charter They think it works in the same way as the American Bill of Rights, which has fared much better over time than ours has, as much older as well, of course.
And much more foundational.
Well, yes, but even in the U.S., though, I think we've all made a mistake. In the Anglo world, we've made a mistake, and it's a very, very old mistake. To go back even to the time of the Magna Carta. So the original problem was the king. And the king, depending upon the king, of course, but kings were tyrants. Their word was the law. And then over time, with great difficulty, Magna Carta, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1688, and the American Declaration of Independence, and so on, over time, what we did was take power away from the king and give it to the legislature. And that's good, right? Because the monarch is hereditary and the legislature is elected. So power to the people. Great. Except that over time, legislatures showed that they can be tyrants too. C-63. And all kinds of other things that have happened through the ages. And so the Americans first came along and said, we're going to try and fix that too. So they created a Bill of Rights, which limits what legislatures can do. But to do that, they had to give power to the courts. So from the king to legislature, from legislature to courts, and now the courts are screwing it up. And the courts are giving power back to the administrative state, which is the king. So here's the mistake we made. We've been just moving power around from king to legislature to courts to administrative state. We've been moving it around from place to place instead of taking power away. And if you take power
How about instead of adopting responsibility for?
The problem is that in order for that to work, and in order for the rule of law to work, the people in power have to adhere to the idea. So the rule of law worked for quite a while. Like, there are some periods when it was great.
Yeah.
Right. So the rule of law is restraint on people with power, on legislatures, on executive branch, and even on courts. And as long as the people who occupy those positions believe in the idea, it works. But our people in those positions do not believe in the idea anymore. They have thrown the idea out because it prevents them from doing what they think their job now is, which is to manage stuff. Because management requires agility, it requires responsiveness, it requires you to get in there and muck about with your hands. And that is not the way the rule of law works. The rule of law is this idea that the legislature makes these grand rules based upon important principles that defines the relationship between state and individual. And we can all tell what it is, we can all go read what they are, it's in the books, the law is there for everybody to know. That is not the way it works now. Now, the law is just for the people in power to control and understand and issue by edict whenever it suits them to make sure that the little people are doing what they're supposed to do. So the rule of law is in direct conflict with what all our rulers think their job now is.
Well, there's no glory and virtue to be obtained in applying the law that someone else passed, right?
Exactly so.
Well, but coming back to your point, Jordan, as well about who decides what hate speech is. I mean, we have this in the UK where for certain offences, the evidence that the languages are well in, but a non-crime hate incident, which is when you haven't committed any crime, but nonetheless this will be recorded by the police on your record and potentially used against you in employment interviews and so on, is based on your self-perception of what motivated your offender who afflicted you in some way to do what they did. So if you were to make some sort of joke at my expense and I concluded that it was to do with my immigration status or ethnicity or whatever, I could then say, well, this is clearly a hate incident that you've...
Right, and the rationale for that would be, well, who would know better than the person who was directly affected, and who's to question that?
Than the victim,
yeah,
I'd say.
Well, and the answer to that, if you have any sense, is, well, what if the purported victim is a manipulative psychopath? And the general response to that is, well, all those people are just victims too. Right, and so this will get us back into the hate discussion. how do you define hate? Well, you just said you allow the purported target of the hate to define it. And what they do is they say that they feel hated. So it's a second order form of evidence. The primary evidence in principle is their subjective emotion, but you don't have access to that, so you have to accept their record of their subjective emotion, and you accept that in a manner that isn't questionable. There's no higher authority than their say-so. And the problem with that, it's a variant of the problem with the informants, is that only works, well, it never work, let's get that clear,
Yeah.
but that only works in the ideal situation where people have perfect understanding of the motivation of others, which they don't, and also they're not lying. The problem with that definition of subjective harm is it lays the gates wide open to the Machiavellians and the psychopaths.
Yes, and you're also touching on two other important things, right? So number one, unlike most criminal offenses, which require intent of some
Right.
kind, the intent is not on whether the speaker meant to be hateful.
Right. Yeah, it's not
That's
relevant.
others-
Intent is not relevant,
Right.
right? That's terrifying.
And also, the other thing that's not relevant is truth.
Mm.
If you speak a true fact that is interpreted as a hateful fact and has this effect on somebody, well, that's not going to be a defense either,
Right.
right? So you are essentially, one of the effects of this kind of legislation is to say you are not allowed to speak the truth,
Right.
because that truth,
Regardless of intent.
regardless of intent, and regardless of historical fact,
Yeah.
we are outlawing an effect.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Okay.
And to expand that even further, with comedy, it's interesting because, of course, Scotland, where some of the most ridiculous legislation is being passed, is the place which hosts the biggest arts and comedy festival in the world, the Edinburgh Fringe.
Right.
And to your point about truth, well, you don't even have to be saying something true. At this point now, they've passed a bill which means that comedians could be investigated for jokes they make. Now, that is a level of detachment from context and reality that is even a level above simply, or someone made a true comment. What if I said something sarcastically on stage as a comedian? And what's interesting is comedy seems to be being very particularly targeted, but nobody goes to Macbeth at the theatre and says, oh, I went to the theatre and then this guy went crazy and stabbed his friend. No one says that. But with comedy, for some reason, the character on stage is increasingly being perceived as having the opinions that he's jokingly saying. And so that's another level. So
That's right. There's no distinction between the role and the actor.
quite. And what's interesting, if you abstract even further from that, if you've watched Game of Thrones, the scene where you really truly discover that King Joffrey's gone mad is when he cuts off the tongue of the jester in his court.
Yeah.
Right.
And this symbolism is
It's perfect.
Yeah.
it's been used throughout history to portray the final conversion into tyranny of a ruler.
Well, that's why there was gestures.
Exactly.
It's like that was one of the ways everybody.
Who is that? I don't know. Maybe I'll like one. Oh man, arthritis is so annoying. it's like, you know it hurts, but you want to hurt it even more just because it pisses you off. But you can't because it's just there. So yeah, it's really slow going with the live streams. Like, you see these people and they're going on the live stream like a really long time. Like a really long time. But for me, like, shorts was helping me get subscribers pretty fast. Like, shorts. Like TikTok. I was listening to a guy today talk about how TikTok is like, the most popular, and then it's being sold off, and then like Zuckerberg with Facebook is spending money on AI. Yeah, so, and Apple's value has went up, and we're ahead in AI. I think I seen that guy on CNN. Shit, I sucked some ash. Oh. Okay, so it seems to be lacking something. It was supposed to just get awesome right there, but it didn't. Depends on what you think is awesome. But yeah, I'm gonna do some art shows. It's gonna be dope. Gotta get real serious with it. I'm alright with walking around and stuff, you know. I just can't run like I used to, and it pisses me off because I broke my big toe and I got arthritis. I really don't want to run, but I used to love to run. Green Greg says he used to run a lot, but now he done got older and he got that heart issue, and he says he can't run that far. Braid. Yeah, Spotify's pretty cool because it'll keep playing you similar songs. Hard browsing on Spotify. I can't remember if I played this. Go back to my liked songs. So a lot of podcasts, and yeah, so like I thought I seen somebody go live on TikTok the other day. Like, I think you can go live on TikTok. Yep, that's where everybody at. They're on TikTok. That's crazy. Everybody's on TikTok right now. Can you believe it? That's why they want them to sell the company, because TikTok bringing in a whole lot of cash. That's what happened with the weed too, back in the day, from the Grass documentary. Remember Grass? Wait, what was we talking about? Oh yeah, TikTok. Man, I don't give a fuck, man. Just put it on one of them. That's why I like techno music, because they don't talk that much. Some of the best songs have no words, but some of the best songs are masterpieces because they have a vocal, like a good vocal sample that's not overly repeated. But holy fuck, this dude has a lot of tractors. How you do that, man? You gotta get a loan from the bank and then you gotta pay the bank just in time. Or they be starting off with like a pocket full of cash with a discount on a loan with a high down payment. I heard people can do it with 0 down payment, but there's an OG talking about he can do it. He did his first deal with a large down payment. Then he flipped it. Yeah, it's just like Farming Simulator, you know? You just gotta have something to move around everything. You can't pick up everything with your bare hands. You need help, and we have help. It's called hydraulics. This chick on a live stream was saying that old people go crazy because they so lonely. The people that's in the country will go crazy. Like the people that's like a long way away from civilization, they go crazy because they're so lonely. She was saying that they was going crazy because they were so lonely. They over there talking to themselves and stuff. I mean, that ain't much different than live streaming, because then you would just be talking to yourself. If you just live stream and talking to yourself, it's like the same thing. But I mean, it's obvious to talk to yourself, you know, and like trying to keep yourself company, but she was a funny chick though. Yeah, she was a funny chick. Man, I'm trying to tell you. This mohawk growing fast. Just go ahead and save your long hair for the mohawk. Bring back the mullet. You see that dude, Theo Vaughn? He's got the mullet. That's the only dude I know that's like rocking the mullet. But I'm pretty sure there's plenty of people with a mullet right now, like really happy with their mullet. Cause like I used to have a ducktail that was just like a mullet. It's like the mini mullet.
Red.
The mini mullet. Yeah, I know that chick, Rainbow Stacy, she goes live. Just seen her the other day. Subscribe to her channel. She could rock a mullet. Like the way she does her hair right now, it's like, you know, just the top in a ponytail and the sides and the back are buzzed. That's how the Nordics used to wear their hair. What was I saying? Like, oh yeah, with the mullet. Like, I could imagine her wearing a mullet because they're badass and, you know, she want to look badass. Yeah, mullets are just hardcore, you know. It'd be like probably like pigtails for women. Like women love pigtails. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this. This app keeps getting stuck, yo. Homeboy was parking garage. Damn, I ain't scrolling down that. Fuck that. You'd be there for days trying to scroll down with this thing. People really out there live streaming. People really out there live streaming. Whoa. That looks awesome. Yeah, it's cool. Flug. How do you pronounce flug? I just say flug. I never pronounced it in my mind, flug. But it could be that he goes by flug. But every time I looked at it, I always thought it was flug. Everybody's on TikTok. I mean, the most I see on like people's lives is like 200 when it's just like scrolling up, because you don't really see when you're just like scrolling up the other lives that are on like widescreen. The almighty dollar. Almighty dollar. You know, the dollar's been almighty a long time. Yep, definitely. Everybody's on TikTok right now. Do you have your TikTok app on your phone? I bet you do. You got that TikTok. Yeah. I need to download it myself. Imagine having a girlfriend and your girlfriend brought you a whole burger.
No one can convince you to a clarity. But let me drop some truth into the tangent. I've been better on the water, deeper in the drink, and stronger in the swim than any man alive.
Give me a Ric Flair woo. They really like the Komatsus.
Does a family's past always haunt the present? Skullwater is a coming-of-age novel about identity and displacement that explores family, loyalty, and history in South Korea. Set in the 1950s and 1970s, the audiobook follows Insu, the son of a Korean mother and a GI father, who ends up on a quest that sends him and his friends into some of South Korea's darkest corners. Listen now on Spotify.
You're hearing this ad because you're listening to our free Spotify experience. Discover new ways to listen to your favorite music without ad breaks anywhere you go, including offline with Spotify Premium. It's just you and wherever your listening takes you next.
Sometimes creating an ad campaign can feel like you're talking on mute. That's why there's Spotify's advertising. Will help your business turn up the volume and reach an engaged audience that's ready to hear and see your message. Learn more at ads.spotify.com.
Crush a car in a monster truck. Red Nose Day believes that less childhood poverty means more childhood, and more childhood means more childhood. Donate to win at rednoseday.org/dreamstakes.
Wait a minute.
That's my jam, son.